They say the house is empty when you're the only one left in it, but I learned that isn't true. The house has its own life, its own quiet breathing, and when you're alone, you're just a guest in its stillness. My parents had gone on their annual 2-week trip, leaving me with the run of our old 3-story Victorian home. It was the first time they'd ever trusted me to be by myself for more than a weekend, and the freedom felt intoxicating. But it only took a few days for the silence to stop feeling like freedom and start feeling like an open invitation for something else. I realized, too late, that the house wasn't just breathing, it was listening. Our house was a relic, the kind with creaky floorboards that spoke a language of their own, and a perpetually cold spot in the hallway no matter how high you cranked the heat. My parents loved its character, its history. I just thought it was old. The first week was great. I played video games until 3 a.m., ate cereal for dinner, and reveled in the blissful, unrestricted solitude. But as the days bled into the second week, a quiet unease began to settle in. It started with the little things. The antique grandfather clock in the study, which had been broken for as long as I could remember, began to tick. I'd be in the kitchen and I'd hear the heavy metallic swing of the pendulum, a sound I thought I'd imagined until I went and saw it swaying, a ghost of its former self, before it would stop again. I'd shrug it off as an old house settling, a draft, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But the ticks weren't random, they seemed to follow a pattern, a slow, deliberate 1, 2, 3, then silence, only to resume again an hour later. The pattern felt like a question, and the silence felt like a breath held in anticipation of an answer I didn't have. Then came the footsteps. Not the creaks of the floorboards I was used to, but a distinct, heavy tread on the second-story landing, just outside my parents' closed bedroom door. It was the sound of someone walking with purpose, and it always happened late at night, after I'd turned off all the lights and was trying to fall asleep. My heart would pound in my chest as I lay there, trying to convince myself it was just the house's old timber contracting in the cool night air. But timber doesn't shuffle its feet. Timber doesn't pause outside a door. One night I got brave. Or maybe just stupid. I grabbed a baseball bat from my closet and crept out of my room, listening. The sounds stopped the moment my door opened. I stood there in the dark, the hallway stretching out before me, empty and silent. I saw nothing, but the air was thick and heavy, and a cold spot I had never felt before clung to the area right outside my parents' room. I slammed my door shut and didn't sleep a wink. The occurrences grew more personal, more invasive. I'd be watching a movie on the couch, and a faint whisper would seem to come from just behind me, too indistinct to make out, but just clear enough to send a shiver down my spine. The whisper would always cease the moment I turned my head. It felt like a game. A cat and mouse chase where I was always the mouse and the cat was everywhere and nowhere at once. The final straw was the door. The basement door. It was a heavy old thing with a latch that was always a bit loose. I'd always made sure it was tightly latched, pushing it firmly to hear the satisfying click. But I would come downstairs in the morning to find it ajar, a sliver of darkness showing, the kind that promised nothing good. I started propping a chair against it. The next morning, the chair would be upright, a foot or two away from the door, which was once again slightly open. The door wasn't just opening, it was being opened. I felt a profound sense of violation, like my last sanctuary was being breached. The house wasn't just a host to some benign presence. It was a cage, and something was trying to get in. Or, worse, get out. The last night was the culmination of everything. I was holed up in my room, listening to the cacophony of the house's life. The ticking clock, the shuffling upstairs, the faint, disembodied whispers, all seemed to have converged. The whispers were no longer indistinct. They were coalescing into a single, low voice that seemed to be murmuring my name from just outside my door. It was a sound that didn't feel like it came from a person, but from something deeper, older. I held my breath, clutching the baseball bat, my heart hammering against my ribs. The footsteps on the landing returned, but this time they were different. They weren't just shuffling, they were dragging, a heavy scraping sound, like something being pulled across the floor. The sound grew closer, slower until it was right outside my door. I heard a soft, scraping noise, a sound of something moving under the door. I froze, my eyes fixed on the small gap at the bottom of the door. Slowly, impossibly, a single, gnarled finger, thin and pale, slid into view. It flexed once, twice, and then began to slowly scratch at the floorboards, its movements deliberate and sickeningly purposeful. I screamed, a raw, primal sound that was choked off by a sudden, absolute silence. The finger retreated, the scraping stopped, and the house fell completely still. I sat there for hours, frozen in place, until the first light of dawn crept through my window. When the sun was fully up, I slowly crept out of my room, bat in hand. The hallway was empty. The cold spot was gone. The basement door was shut and locked. I never found an explanation. I didn't wait for my parents to come back. I packed a bag and stayed at a friend's place for the rest of their trip. Even now, years later, I can't be in a house alone at night. The silence always seems to have a weight to it, and I can hear the faint echo of a clock that shouldn't be ticking and the memory of a finger that wasn't there. I know the house never stopped breathing. It was just holding its breath, waiting for me to be alone again. The worst part about being alone wasn't the quiet. It was the way the familiar sounds of your own house could twist into something sinister when there was no one else around to confirm their normalcy. Our cabin in the woods was usually a place of joyful chaos, filled with the laughter of my siblings and the booming voice of my father. But this weekend, I was the only one there. My parents had left early for a wedding, and my older siblings had already gone back to their college dorms. I was supposed to leave the next morning, but a last-minute change of plans left me with one solitary night in our secluded retreat. I thought I'd enjoy the peace, but the woods have a way of making silence feel heavy, and the cabin had secrets it seemed eager to share now that no one else was listening. The cabin was old, built by my grandfather, with thick log walls and a stone fireplace that always smelled faintly of wood smoke. Outside, the forest pressed in close, a dense tapestry of pines and shadows. The first day alone was uneventful. I spent it reading by the fire, enjoying the stillness. But as dusk deepened into night, a subtle shift occurred. The usual creaks and groans of the old wood seemed amplified, taking on a more deliberate quality. I'd hear a branch scrape against the window, and it would sound less like nature and more like a hesitant tap. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild in the solitude. But then the knocking started. It wasn't loud, not at first, just a faint, rhythmic thumping coming from somewhere within the walls, almost like a trapped animal. I walked from room to room, trying to pinpoint the source, but it seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. The knocking grew more insistent as the night wore on. It changed from a random thumping to a slow, deliberate pattern. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more. It was unsettlingly regular, like a code I couldn't decipher. I checked outside, thinking maybe a branch was hitting the wall in a strange rhythm, but the night was still and windless. Inside, the air felt colder, and the shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed to deepen and writhe. I tried turning on the television, but the static only amplified the feeling of isolation. The knocking continued, a persistent, unnerving pulse in the silence. It wasn't just a sound. I felt it as a low vibration through the floorboards. I would press my ear to the rough log wall, trying to isolate the source, only for the sound to immediately cease on that specific wall and resume from another. It was a cruel, disorienting game, and my mind began to unravel. Then I started hearing other things. Soft scratches like tiny claws dragging across the inside of the walls would accompany the knocking. It sounded like something was trying to get out, or perhaps trying to get in. My anxiety began to escalate. The familiar comfort of the cabin was gone, replaced by a creeping dread. I locked all the doors and windows, even though I knew the flimsy wooden frames wouldn't offer much resistance against anything truly determined. The knocking would shift, patterns sometimes sounding frantic and panicked, a rapid-fire series of thuds that would make me jump out of my skin. Other times it would slow down to an agonizing crawl, a single heavy thump that would echo through the entire house, followed by a long, suffocating silence. One time, the rhythmic 3-2 pattern resumed, and I swear I heard a faint, high-pitched giggle from within the walls, a sound so unnatural and childlike that it turned my blood to ice. I found myself huddling in the center of the main room, away from all walls, with every light in the cabin blazing, but the shadows still seemed to press in from the edges. A profound sense of violation settled over me. It felt as though the very structure of the cabin, the logs and plaster that had always felt so solid and protective, had been compromised. Sleep was impossible. Every rustle of leaves outside, every creak of the floorboards above, sent jolts of fear through me. The knocking continued its relentless rhythm, and the scratching sounds grew more frantic. Then I heard a new sound, a soft whimpering, like a small animal in distress, seemed to be coming from the wall right behind my bed. It was faint, almost swallowed by the other noises, but it was undeniably there. The combination of the knocking, the scratching, and the whimpering created a terrifying symphony of unseen activity within the very structure of the cabin. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to block out the sounds, but they seemed to penetrate the wood and the fabric, echoing directly in my ears. I felt a cold dread grip me, a primal fear of the unknown that lurked just beyond the thin barrier of the walls. I began to wonder if I was truly alone, or if something had been waiting for everyone else to leave. The air grew thick with a metallic, sour smell, like stale blood mixed with damp earth, and I could have sworn I saw a faint moving shadow under the bedroom door, though when I looked directly at it, it vanished. The noises became a chorus of despair, and I felt my sanity begin to slip. The climax came just before dawn. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by a sustained, violent shaking of the wall beside my bed. The whimpering intensified, turning into a series of desperate, choked gasps. I could hear the wood splintering, the drywall cracking. I scrambled out of bed and backed away, my eyes wide with terror, as a bulge began to form in the wall. It grew larger and larger, and then, with a sickening tearing sound, the wood and plaster burst inward. What I saw wasn't an animal. It was a small, pale hand, its fingers long and unnaturally thin, reaching out from the darkness within the wall. The whimpering stopped, replaced by a wet, gurgling sound. I didn't wait to see more. I ran. I threw open the front door and fled into the pre-dawn woods, not stopping until I reached the main road miles away. I never went back to the cabin alone. My parents said it was just an old house settling, maybe some rodents in the walls. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. To this day, the sound of knocking, even a gentle tap, sends a shiver of unease down my spine. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear it. That slow, deliberate rhythm, a ghostly echo from the darkness within the walls. And I can't help but wonder what happened to the thing that was trapped, or what else might be living in the spaces between our world and the next, just waiting for the silence. When you live in a house for a long time, you start to feel like you know every inch of it, every quirk and imperfection. But what if you're wrong? What if the house you've come to know is just the version it wants you to see? What if it waits until you're alone, until the last car has pulled away, to reveal its true self? I always thought of a house as a shell, an inanimate object we fill with our lives. I learned that's a dangerous assumption. My house, I've come to realize, is not a shell. It is a thing with its own desires, its own way of seeing the world, and it was just waiting for me to be its only audience. My parents and sister were gone for a weekend trip, leaving me with our brand new suburban house. We had only been there a year, and everything was still pristine. The walls were painted a neutral off-white, the furniture was modern and simple, and the large windows let in so much light that it was impossible for a shadow to linger. I was thrilled to have the place to myself. No sister to fight with, no parents to check in with. It was just me and the house, and I settled in for a long, quiet weekend of video games and pizza. The silence was, at first, a relief. But as the first evening wore on, a feeling of being watched began to creep in. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible sensation, like a prickling on the back of my neck. I would turn my head, but see nothing. The house was exactly as I had left it. That's when the changes started. Small, easy to dismiss things. I came back into the living room after making a sandwich and noticed a small decorative elephant on the mantelpiece had been turned. It was facing the opposite direction from how I always remembered it. I chalked it up to my own carelessness. Maybe I had bumped it. Later, I went into the bedroom and found my sister's jewelry box, which had been neatly placed on her dresser, was now sitting on the floor. I picked it up, feeling a familiar frustration at her messiness, and put it back in its place, muttering about how she always left things everywhere. But I knew, with a creeping certainty, that she hadn't been home all day. The next morning, the strangeness escalated. I was sitting at the kitchen island, drinking my coffee, and I noticed the large, framed family photo hanging in the hallway was crooked, just a few degrees off-center. I went to straighten it, and as I did, I noticed the coffee mug I had just used was sitting on the counter. I hadn't put it there. It was in the sink. The feeling of being watched became a constant pressure, a weight on my shoulders. I began to actively check things. I took pictures of the living room from different angles, documenting the position of every book on the bookshelf, every cushion on the couch. I felt like a mad scientist in my own home, a feeling of paranoia that was both embarrassing and terrifying. The hum, which had been a barely there electrical whisper, began to grow louder, a subtle thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the floor. It was like the house was purring and I was its prey. The subtle movements continued to drive me to the brink of my sanity. The sofa would be pushed a few inches further from the wall. A lamp I had left off was now on. The coffee table, a heavy mahogany piece, would be rotated a few degrees, just enough to be noticeable but subtle enough to be gaslit by. I would frantically check my photos, comparing the before and after, confirming that I wasn't just imagining things. I started to hear new sounds too. Not the usual creaks of an old house, but a soft, sliding sound like heavy objects being moved across the floor. I would stop everything, holding my breath and listening, but the sound would always cease the moment I went to investigate. The dread was a living thing now, a suffocating blanket that wrapped around me every time I was alone in a room. The hum grew so loud I could feel it in my teeth, a low, buzzing static that was the soundtrack to my descent into terror. I realized that the house wasn't just moving things, it was rearranging itself, creating a new geometry of fear. And I was its unwilling participant. The final night, I was holed up in my bedroom, my heart pounding in my ears. I had set up my phone to record a time-lapse of the living room, hoping to finally capture the proof that I wasn't going insane. I watched the live feed on my laptop, the camera pointed squarely at the sofa and the coffee table. For what felt like hours, nothing happened, just stillness. Then the hum in my room grew to a deafening roar, a sound that felt less like electricity and more like a massive guttural growl. And on the screen, in the dead center of the living room, the coffee table began to move. It wasn't a sudden jolt. It was a slow, deliberate slide, as if an immense, unseen hand was pushing it. The sofa followed, a quiet scrape against the hardwood floor. Then the lamps, one by one, flickered and turned off, plunging the living room, on the screen, into total darkness. The hum stopped, and for a terrifying moment, there was a complete and utter silence. Then a shadow, not cast by any light source, began to move across the floor of the room on my screen. It was not a human shape. It was amorphous, shifting, and it blotted out the darkness, somehow making it even darker. I don't know what it was, or what it wanted, but I wasn't going to stay to find out. I grabbed my car keys, ran out the front door, and never looked back. I didn't wait for my family to get home. I stayed at a friend's house for a week, and when my parents finally convinced me to come back, I couldn't look at the house the same way. We moved a few months later, and to this day, when I'm alone in a building, I can't shake the feeling that the furniture is just waiting for me to turn my back. I still hear the ghost of that hum in the silence, a low, vibrating thrum that reminds me that a house isn't just a building. It's a living, breathing thing. And some houses, I learned, just don't like to be alone.